Greetings and salutations. It is I, Mr. Nothing, the museum curator of the weird and the strange and the host, who might be a medieval literature professor. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all of the unusual literature that I've found in my travels throughout the University of Missouri. So today is interesting because although I am around the weird, I typically focus on strange and unusual things. Today I just finished and I want to talk about a different book that I read. One that is very normal, as much as normal can be, if normal even exists. So I want to talk about a book about the life of a English professor, his many loves, and the ultimate death that he faces and that faces us all. I am talking about Stoner by John Williams. I don't have a physical copy. I used my Kindle. I really want to buy a physical copy because I really like the cover, which I'll put somewhere around here. It seems really simple in terms of just featuring the character of William Stoner on the cover. It seems simple, but I really like it because it seems like the exact kind of guy that I figured William Stoner would be. A very forgettable face, a look of sadness and wisdom beyond his years on his face, and a lot hiding below the surface that we don't see. I wanted to talk about that. It's a fascinating book, and I'm just going to say up front, I really loved it. It might be the best book I read of 2020. And that's saying something because I also read House of Leaves. But Stoner left me with a different feeling than House of Leaves. So maybe I'll talk about that at the end of the year. But yeah, for those that don't know, John Williams, the author of Stoner, something interesting about him is this book is about higher education, and he didn't really make it through college. He struggled, and he eventually dropped out, but he still found success in his literature career. He wrote a couple books. He's not as prolific as other authors I've talked about on this channel. I think he only wrote like 4-ish books. And Stoner might be one of the last. And he wrote a couple plays too, and some poetry. So he's not very prolific, but he's written enough, I think, to earn him a place in American Literature Society. The interesting thing is I've never heard about John Williams before. The only reason I found out about this book is because I started a booktube channel, and I think I heard it first from Everyone Who Reads It Must Converse. Noah was talking about Stoner and how he really liked the book, and that put it on my radar for me. I don't think I would have found out about this book without this channel, without booktube. Maybe that's because this book was written in the 60s, and we haven't fully canonized the stuff in the 60s as important or unimportant. I don't know. Maybe a lot of the world doesn't feel that John Williams is important enough to remember. I certainly disagree with that idea. I don't really know why I haven't heard about it. In fact, I'm pretty sure I could have gone my whole life without knowing this book exists. And it wouldn't have hurt me, but I feel like I would have missed out on something, a good experience, in my opinion. We're about 4 minutes into this video now. And I want to get through this really quickly, but I don't think I will. I think it's going to be a longer video. These are my notes on Stoner. I wrote a lot, and because there's a lot to chew on, a lot that I don't think I parsed through. Days later, weeks later, months later, I'm going to be coming back to this and thinking about it. I think it's one of those books that I have to read again to fully appreciate. Which I do. I definitely want to buy the physical copy of the book when I get the chance because it was worth it in my opinion. And so without further ado, I'll provide a little summary, a little analysis, and we will move on from there. So Stoner starts in 1910. It follows William Stoner. He's about 18-ish. and he works on his father's farm. He has his whole life, and he really doesn't aspire to anything else. He'll continue working on it because I think he's content to do that. But his father approaches him and mentions that there's a agricultural program at the University of Missouri that he wants his son to participate in. He's not really giving him a choice in the matter, and he looks to his mom, but she's like, "You have to listen to your father, son." So he decides to go to college and follow through with that. So at college, Stoner finds that he's getting B's in his courses, which he doesn't really take much offense to. He's happy that he's not getting worse, but he's not really trying to do any better. During his sophomore year, he takes a class with Archer Sloan, a wonderful name, by the way. Sloan teaches a sophomore study of English, and he actively questions Stoner about a Shakespearean poet, and Stoner is stumped about it. But it inspires him to take more English classes, and he kind of drops his agricultural curriculum without telling his parents. And he eventually decides that it's time to go to graduate school, since he's not really willing to leave the world of higher education quite yet. He tells his parents this, and his dad is kind of disappointed. He was hoping, to pass down the farm to his son, and now he can't do that. But he accepts his choice, but he kind of distances himself from his son in the process, hiring a black field hand to do the work of his son, so he doesn't help as often or really anymore. And so there's that growing disconnect between his family and Stoner, the old world and the new, as it would be. Makes friends with Gordon Finch and Dave Masters. And during one drunken outing, I think it's Masters who asserts that none of these three people would find success outside of the college. Because they're not strong enough, they're not tough enough to make it in the outside world, and the only reason they're still in college is because it's an asylum, a refuge of sorts, that protects them from the dangers of the outside world. Gordon laughs this off, but Stoner kind of takes it to heart, and I think he understands it without really taking offense to it. Eventually World War I breaks out at this time, and Gordon seems fit on going to war because that's his choice. And Stoner talks about this with Masters and Sloan, who inform him that Gordon really seems to be going to war because he doesn't want to be trapped in the confines of higher education his whole life. This is his act of rebellion, and afterwards he's going to come back and go through the slow death that is higher education, and that'll be that. But he'll at least have this serving his country. Meanwhile, Stoner decides not to go to war. He doesn't really feel a sense of patriotism, and Masters decides to go to war, and he dies overseas, which is unfortunate. Sloan begins hearing of all these young men dying overseas, and it really strikes him pretty hard. He falls into a deep despair and depression that lasts pretty much until he dies, and that's sort of the end of his thread in this story. He eventually goes to a party where he meets Edith Bostwick. He falls in love with her. Edith is described as a very shy and reserved girl who took a lot of moral classes and is expected to be the good wife or when she gets married, but also a good daughter. So a lot of restrictions on her life, and this is coming at the end of the Victorian era. So women were in restrictive roles, and it wasn't very good for them. He calls upon Edith several times, dating her. She seems really uncomfortable around him. She never really tries to talk more about herself. Eventually, William proposes, and she's taken aback by that, but she doesn't say no to that. He meets her parents, and they're thrilled about it, although they kind of want him to have more prospects in higher education and teaching. They get married, and it's real quick. I think Edith just wants it out of the way. They have a poor honeymoon. It seems Edith can't stand the sexual encounters. It's really rough for her, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Eventually, Edith decides that she wants to have a child, and once they conceive, Edith just doesn't want to be touched by Stoner. And when she gives birth, she doesn't really want anything to do with the child either. She's content to stay in her room, and be taken care of all the time, while Stoner largely takes care of the child when he can. A couple years later, both of Stoner's parents die, and Edith's father kills himself after the stock market crash, and he loses a lot of money. They both go home to see their parents, or to see what their lives have become. And Stoner discovers that he doesn't really feel a connection to the farm anymore. He's changed too much since higher education, and there's no connection anymore. And he goes home, and he develops a stronger bond with his daughter Grace Stoner, who I don't know if I said their name, he becomes more enraptured with becoming a better teacher. Meanwhile, Edith comes back from her funeral and being with her mom, and she's very active and social. She starts playing piano, and she hangs out with people, joins the theater of all things. She seems like a different person, although this changes really soon as she drops all that and she goes back. She sees the bond forming between Stoner and Grace, and she decides she doesn't want any of that. So she kind of takes Grace away from Stoner and forces her to become a popular girl at her school and dress in the more feminine ways, and basically tries to uproot Stoner's life so that he's no longer so near his daughter or even at the house so much. And so Stoner takes on more teaching responsibilities because of this. That's generally like how their relationship is at that moment. Around this time at school, Stoner encounters Charles Walker. He's a graduate student who wants to take one of his seminars. He's also disabled. He has a wonky arm. I don't know what exactly to call that. He's Hollis Lomax's student, and he just recommends that Charles take this class as a way to be able to graduate on time. However, Charles reveals himself to not be a very good student. He doesn't do the readings as assigned. He's constantly obstructing Stoner's teaching methods, and he doesn't even do the final assignment, going so far as to be obnoxious. And Stoner gives him an F for this, which Lomax doesn't really like. Gordon Finch, who is the department chair at this point, allows him to be the sort of one of the chair members, the committee members, for Charles Walker's sort of defense on whether or not he can stay in the graduate program. And while Lomax and another professor give him a pass, Stoner realizes that he wouldn't be a very effective teacher, and there's a lot of other problems with Charles Walker, so he decides to fail him. And this creates a giant rift between Lomax and Stoner. Ultimately, Lomax becomes like the department head, slightly below Gordon Finch, and so he allows Charles Walker to stay in school, and he holds a grudge against Stoner for the rest of their career, even going so far as to retaliate and take away some classes, which Stoner doesn't get back until he rebels in his own private way and is able to, defeat Lomax in a minor way. He sort of falls into a depression, which he doesn't leave until he develops a love affair with Catherine Driscoll, one of his students, which is highly unethical. It develops into a very powerful relationship that Edith knows about and doesn't care to do anything about, because to do anything about it, she would have to confront and talk to Stoner, which she doesn't want to do. But Driscoll really seems to love Stoner and vice versa. There's an understanding between the two of them, and there's a real strong connection. Eventually, though, people start figuring out, including Lomax, who intends to hold it against Stoner and get him to resign. Driscoll decides that she's going to leave the university and find a spot somewhere else. which upsets Stoner, but allows them both to have what they want, which is Stoner can keep his job and Driscoll won't be exposed and have her entire career ruined. And just like that, Grace gets pregnant, and she ends up leaving the family with her new husband. Unfortunately, he dies during World War II, and Grace develops an alcohol problem, alcohol addiction issue that upsets Stoner, but he can't really do anything about it because she's left what she's viewed as a prison in this household, and so that's sort of the end of their relationship. It's called upon when he reaches his 60s for Stoner to retire, and he's a bit hesitant to do that. But he eventually discovers that he has a tumor inside of him, and so he's just ready to retire. Which he's doing it on his own terms, which upsets Lomax. He has the surgery, but the tumor is still there, and so the story ends with him considering whether or not his life had any meaning or value, and he's kind of on the fence about it, and then he dies, and that's where the story ends. So there's quite a bit I want to talk about. In terms of analysis, the first thing I want to talk about are the ideas of death, existentialism, and absurdity in this story. Death comes up a lot. The first way it comes up is I think John Williams is seeding it into the story because one of the things that Stoner was focusing on in his early graduate career was how the early medieval poets viewed death as an old friend. They welcomed it like a reprieve from this life and all that they've experienced. But the later Renaissance poets, he notes, viewed death with pity. They hated it and they wished it would just go away because they wanted more time on this earth. And Stoner finds interest in that, and I think it's interesting that John Williams mentions that, especially how death plays a role, or the fear of death plays a role later on in this story. I think it's also something that came up in The Sandman, which I was a fan of too. Briefly mentioned, not a big theme there though. The first way death plays a role, one of the characters who experiences that fear of death is Stoner's father. Stoner's father hopes to pass down his legacy. That's his meaning in life. He's hoping that his son will go through college, get his degree in agriculture, and then carry on the legacy of the farm. However, he eventually learns that his son is not going to college for that, and he's never going to come back to the farm. And that causes him and his son to drift apart. I believe that drift apart comes because his father realizes the absurdity of life and he can't handle it. As Albert Camus said in The Myth of Sisyphus, once you realize that there's absurdity, you can either revel in it or you can fall into despair. And I think by creating that rift, his father kind of falls into that despair, and he has that existential quandary that prevents him from interacting with the family that he presumably once loved. Another character that it shows up with is Grace, or not Grace. It shows up with Edith. Edith is kind of falling into existential despair at all times because she's stuck in this Victorian era where she has no choice, and everything she does in life is in service to others. She has to be a good daughter. She has to take moral classes and not be a sex freak or whatever it is that they were worried about women being in the early 1900s. She has to be a good wife to a husband that she honestly can't stand. There is some love there, but I don't think it's enough to sustain a marriage. And it's only there because Edith knows she has to get married, and why not get married to Stoner? So she's constantly in this state of absurdity where she realizes that her life has no meaning because it's always in service of others. And while she could revel in that, although I understand why she's not, she ultimately constantly falls in despair, trying to find meaning in other ways and realizing that's not going to benefit her. And she only shows scorn towards Stoner as a means of coming to grips with that despair that she feels because of it. Not good. I would also say that Archer Sloane realizes this once people start dying during World War I. He had high hopes for his students, and now he's seeing that those hopes are dashed and falling into an existential despair that follows him for the rest of his life. I would say the only two characters that don't feel that existential despair to a great degree are Gordon Finch and William Stoner. Stoner feels it at times. He senses it when his parents die, and he goes back and he no longer feels that connection to his old life, and so I feel like if there had been a connection, that existential despair, that realization of the absurdity would have grown. But it's possibly because he moved on to a new life that it saved him from realizing the meaninglessness of it all. However, when Lomax decides to intervene and allows Charles Walker to become a student and kind of mess up the higher education system, it grows even more. He falls into a depression because he realizes he has no control over his life. He has no control over the meaning that he finds in higher education, because people like Charles Walker can just come on in and find whatever success they want, even though they might not be very good at their jobs. I would say Stoner is good at working around that, reveling in the absurd rather than letting it grip him with despair. Although it does try to grip him at times, but he manages to power through. Gordon Finch, meanwhile, like he never lets the absurd grip him. Even when Dave Masters pretty much straight up tells him that everything is meaningless and he wouldn't find any worth outside of higher education, he just laughs at that. And so I think he's he's an absurd hero in a lot of ways. That is until the end of Stoner's life, where in a delusion, Stoner reminds him of Dave Masters, and Gordon Finch just kind of gasps. And I think he's realizing the inevitable death that comes for us all, and how he may have whittled away his life in higher education, but ultimately there's no meaning in that. And I don't think he was prepared for that sudden realization. Especially at the end of Stoner's life. But the story kind of ends there, so I don't have much more to go on beyond that. And I really don't know how I can keep talking about death, existentialism, and absurdity. I'm not well versed in those subjects. I got a minor in philosophy in my undergrad. But these are big topics, so if you have anything to share about those things, feel free to do that. I might be completely wrong with my analysis in regards to this particular thing. Another thing I want to talk about is Edith Bostwick. Edith is a tragic character. Her life is controlled from her very birth, as she grows up in this privileged society, and she's expected to act a certain way. And she realizes she never has any control over anything, and no matter what she does, she just can't seem to find meaning. And she even tries to help Grace. I believe she's sincere in her effort to help Grace avoid the life that she had, but she ultimately fails in that because in doing so, she takes Grace away from her father figure, who she actually loves being around. Edith shows nothing but disdain towards Stoner at times. She loves him a little bit, but not enough to sustain their marriage. She ultimately just gives her approval for Stoner to have an affair, as long as no one at large figures out, I guess. A character that she reminds me of is Kathy Ames from East of Eden, written by John Steinbeck. Kathy was a tragic character, but John Steinbeck made no effort to give us her backstory, whereas we know about Edith's backstory and how she's a victim of the time period that she's living in. Kathy is told that we're told that Kathy is a sadist, but no real backstory on how that happened or the circumstances that made her commit murder and bribe politicians and treat everyone around her like garbage. But they're very, very similar in that they treat their protagonist husbands as dirt and leave them like feeling a sense of emptiness and loneliness that even though they wanted a marriage and to feel happy with that marriage, they never get that. And so I feel like there's a lot of comparisons between Kathy and Edith. I certainly think Edith is the more feminist character because we're given a lot of explanation into her past, and although she does a lot of mean things to Stoner. It's not mean for the sake of women are bad. There's an understanding that she's doing the best she can in trying to fight off the existential terror that she feels, and also the shackles that she's been chained on by being a woman in a very uptight society. Another thing that I want to talk about, possibly the last thing, is what was the value of William Stoner's life? In the very beginning of the story, John Williams lays it out for you about what to expect from the story and the kind of person that you might expect to see with William Stoner. I'll give you a little I'll read that to you. An occasional student who comes upon the name may wonder idly who William Stoner was, but he seldom pursues his curiosity beyond a casual question. Stoner's colleagues, who held him in no particular esteem when he was alive, speak of him rarely now. To the older ones, his name is a reminder of the end that awaits them all. And to the younger ones, it is merely a sound which evokes no sense of the past and no identity which can associate themselves or their careers. So what I get from that, like at the very beginning, is I was like, oh wow, this Stoner guy seems unimportant, a real maybe a loser, maybe someone who didn't aspire to much, and who just lived his life without aspiring to anything greater. And I feel like that's not far off from who Stoner is. Like he seems like a down in the dumps kind of dude who doesn't seek out challenges, who doesn't seek out something different, who doesn't want to be anything other than what he is. Like he's given the opportunity for a promotion to become the department chair, and he passes it. He's content with teaching. He's content with doing just that throughout his life. And so you have to wonder, was his life worth living? At the very end, his colleagues and his students would say, well, I don't know who he was. He obviously wasn't anyone important, so there's no value there. However, I don't really feel that any of that is actually true for Stoner, as shown by the story. Like it may seem true initially, but he fights to preserve a marriage with a woman who doesn't actually love him, for the sake of their child, really. And so that benefits Grace in some way, even though later on maybe it doesn't. There's a lot of iffy things there. Let's talk about Grace. He works to preserve the sanctity of higher education from people like Charles Walker, who would be bad teachers and wouldn't inspire the students at all. He sticks up for what he believes, and he rebels in small ways that allow him to do what he's hoping to do in higher education. As he's dying, he kind of recalls his life, and he asks, like, what did I expect? Was this all worth it? And he says, probably not. He wanted love. He didn't really find that, except for with Catherine, maybe. He wanted a successful marriage where he became one with the person he was with, and that never really happened. He wanted to be an effective teacher, and in a possibly damning thing, he says he wasn't. He feels like everything was trivial and he was uninspired. I disagree with that, but those are his thoughts. So, like at the very end of his life, what he thinks matters. And then a few short pages later, he says something else that I think is important. He dimly recalled that he had been thinking of failure, as if it mattered. It seemed to him now that such thoughts were mean, unworthy of what his life had been. So I think that's really a really powerful passage right there. Just a short couple sentences. Where although he thinks he's a failure, he kind of realizes, no, he's not. Like his life was rich to him, and it had value to him. So although the outside observer may say, oh, he aspired to nothing and he did nothing of worth, that's not true necessarily. What matters is what matters to Stoner, and he feels that his life, he gave everything that he could. He worked really hard. And it makes me think, because a lot of people ask if Stoner is a hero. John Williams himself in an interview said, yeah, he thinks that he thinks that William Stoner is a hero because he aspires to be a great teacher, and he is. He cares so much about his career and his life that he gives everything he can. And he's really just a victim of his upbringing and the environment. And I would say to some extent, yeah, maybe he is a hero, but the lack of ambition at times does prevent the hero label from being applied. Still, I think if he believes himself to be to have lived a full life, then we are not wrong to say he didn't. At the end of your life, like what like other people may talk about you, but if you feel that you lived a life worth living, then you're going to die happy. That's what matters. I could go on and on with this book. I'm almost at 35 minutes now. I might have to cut it down a little bit. But there's so much more that I want to talk about. Grace Stoner, how she lives in a dysfunctional household and how it affects her well-being later on in life. Generational trauma. Stoner's prose, which is beautifully written. Everything about how this book is written is just top notch. At times I do have to go back and reread certain passages because there's so much in there. William Stoner himself, what's his deal? Dave Masters, what's his deal? There's so many characters that you could explore and parse through. So many things that I just can't get through right now because I just don't have the time. But because of that, I really enjoyed this book. There's so much to gain from it, and upon second read through, I am certain I will get through so much more. I'll be able to enjoy it a lot more. So yeah, ultimately, I recommend this book. Go seek it out. It's probably not for everyone. It's an in-depth character piece rather than a lot of events happening. But it's still worth reading. I think I like it for the same reason I like East of Eden, in that there's a lot of emotion and a lot of power in the story. It has a lot to say about humanity and people. So yeah, if you have something to say about this book, feel free to comment below. I would love to hear from you, have a discussion about this beautiful book. Otherwise, like, share, and subscribe so that we can get Stoner out to the masses. We can get people stoned. Hey, follow me at Around the Weird on Twitter, where we can talk about, of all things, Stoner, but also maybe the recent election, because that is a big deal on the Twitters right now. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and higher education-y travels. Farewell.